My name is John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Most people remember me as the 35th President of the United States. They remember the speeches, the cameras, the crowds, and the white walls of the White House shining in the sun. History often shows these moments as if they appeared suddenly, as if a man simply stepped onto a stage and became part of something larger than himself. But that is not how a life truly begins. Before the speeches, there were quiet days. Before the decisions, there were long years of uncertainty. Before the world began to listen, there was only a boy trying to understand where he belonged in a very large and complicated world. Tonight, I want to speak softly about those earlier days. Not about power or politics yet, but about the slow beginning of a life that would one day move toward them. If you listen carefully, you may discover that history does not start with great events. It starts with small moments that seem ordinary at the time. A conversation at a dinner table, a book opened on a rainy afternoon, a child lying awake at night wondering what the future might hold. When people think about leaders, they often imagine that those leaders always knew who they would become. They imagine confidence from the very beginning. They imagine certainty, strength, and a clear path forward. But my story did not begin with certainty. My story began with questions. I was born into a family where ambition filled the air almost like music. The Kennedy household was rarely silent. Voices echoed through the rooms. Brothers and sisters moved constantly through the halls. There was laughter, competition, energy, and sometimes disagreement. In a house filled with so many people, it was almost impossible to disappear completely into the background. Yet sometimes I tried. My father believed strongly that life should be lived boldly. To him, the world was not something to watch quietly from a distance. It was something to enter, shape, and influence. He believed that every opportunity should be taken seriously and every challenge should be faced with courage. Around our table, the future was not discussed in vague terms. It was spoken about as something real, something waiting just beyond the horizon. Yet while ambition filled the house, my childhood was not always strong or easy. Illness followed me often during those early years. There were many days when I felt weaker than the boys around me. While other children ran freely through fields or played endless games outdoors, I sometimes remained inside, resting or reading. At the time, I did not see this as a gift. It felt like a limitation. It felt as though the world was moving quickly, somewhere beyond my reach. But time has a way of revealing meaning slowly. Those long, quiet hours shaped the way I looked at life. When you cannot always run with the crowd, you begin to observe the crowd more carefully. You notice the small things others ignore. You hear the tone behind words. You see the quiet struggles behind confident faces. Without realizing it, I was learning to watch people. That skill would later become more valuable than strength alone. My mother, Rose, brought a calm and steady presence into our home. She believed deeply in discipline, education, and faith. She encouraged us to read, to think, and to understand the world beyond our immediate surroundings. Books became one of my closest companions during those quiet periods of childhood. Through them, I traveled across places I'd never seen. I followed explorers across oceans. I listened to the stories of leaders and thinkers who had shaped earlier centuries. I learned that the world had always been filled with challenges, and that every generation had faced moments when the future seemed uncertain. Those stories slowly settled into my imagination. They suggested that history was not distant or unreachable. It was something created by ordinary people placed into extraordinary circumstances. My older brother Joe seemed, even from a young age, perfectly suited for the kind of life my father admired. He was confident and strong. When he entered a room, people noticed him. I respected him deeply, and I often believed that if anyone in our family would step into history, it would be him. In those early years, I did not imagine the path would lead toward me instead. Life often unfolds in ways that no one expects. Childhood continued with its mixture of learning, travel, and family life. We moved through different schools and different cities, always carrying with us the sense that the world was larger than any one place. My father's work exposed us to politics, diplomacy, and international events long before I fully understood them. Conversations about nations, elections, and leaders were common in our home. Even when I was young, I sensed that these discussions carried weight. They were not abstract ideas. They were decisions that shaped the lives of millions of people. At times, I listened quietly while the adults spoke, trying to understand how such large decisions were made. Slowly, a quiet curiosity began to grow inside me. I wanted to understand the forces that moved the world forward. Yet curiosity alone does not create a future. It only opens a door. The years of childhood passed slowly at first, then faster as they always do. Each year added new experiences, new challenges, and new lessons about the people around me. There were moments of confidence and moments of doubt. There were victories that seemed important at the time, and failures that felt heavy in the moment. But each of those moments quietly shaped the path ahead. Looking back now, I see that those early years were not simply preparation for politics or leadership. They were preparation for understanding life itself. Leadership is not built only in grand halls or official offices. It begins in quiet places, long before anyone notices. It begins in the small decisions a person makes when no one is watching. It grows slowly through observation, reflection, and the steady effort to understand the world beyond oneself. At the time, I did not know where those lessons would lead me. I did not know that the coming decades would bring war, responsibility, and moments that would test the strength of nations. I was still only a young man searching for direction. Yet somewhere in those quiet years, a sense of purpose was slowly forming. The world was changing quickly. New challenges were rising beyond the horizon. And without fully realizing it, I was beginning to move toward the path that would one day place me at the center of those changes. When I think back to the early years of my life, the first thing I remember is not politics or ambition. It is sound. The Kennedy house was never truly quiet. Voices moved through every room, doors opened and closed, laughter traveled down hallways. Someone was always speaking, asking questions, arguing, or telling a story. For a boy growing up in such a place, silence felt unusual. Life happened quickly around us, and each of us tried to keep up with the rhythm of the family. My parents believed that children should not grow up slowly or lazily. They believed that the world outside our home was demanding and competitive, and that we needed to be ready for it. My father often reminded us that opportunity did not wait for anyone. If you wanted a place in the world, you had to reach for it. Those words stayed with me for many years, though at the time, I did not fully understand them. My father had already lived many lives before I was old enough to notice. He had worked in business, finance, and government. He had traveled widely and spoken with powerful people across the world. To a young boy, he seemed confident in a way that felt almost impossible to question. When he spoke about the future, he did not speak as if it were uncertain. He spoke as if it were something that could be shaped with the right determination. That belief influenced the atmosphere of our home. Success was never described as a distant dream. It was described as a responsibility. Each of us was expected to try to improve and to push ourselves further than we might have otherwise imagined. Yet for me, those expectations sometimes felt heavy. I was not always the strongest child. My health often slowed me down when I wanted to move faster. While my brothers ran easily through the world, I sometimes felt like I was chasing behind them, trying to catch the same pace. Illness visited often during my childhood. There were days when I felt strong and hopeful, and others when even simple tasks felt difficult. Doctors came and went, advice was given, rest was recommended. For a young boy who wished to prove himself, those moments were frustrating. I wanted to be seen as capable, not fragile. I wanted to stand beside my brothers as an equal, not as the one who needed to pause and recover. But something interesting happens when life forces you to slow down. You begin to see the world from a different angle. While others rush forward, you observe quietly. While others compete loudly, you listen carefully. Slowly, I began to understand that strength can appear in different forms. Some people show strength through speed or physical power. Others discover it through patience, thought, and persistence. I did not realize it then, but those lessons would help shape the person I would later become. My mother played an important role in guiding us through these years. She believed that discipline created character. Each day had structure. Each responsibility mattered. Education was never treated lightly in our home. Books were always close by. Reading was encouraged not as a chore, but as a door to a larger world. During the many hours when illness kept me indoors, those books became companions. Through them, I traveled across distant lands and earlier centuries. I read about explorers who sailed into unknown waters. I read about leaders who faced impossible choices. I read about thinkers who questioned the ideas of their time and changed the direction of history. These stories quietly expanded my imagination. They suggested that the world was filled with possibility, even when the present moment felt limited. Among my siblings, competition was constant, but rarely cruel. We pushed each other forward in small ways every day. Whether through sports, schoolwork, or conversation, each of us wanted to prove that we could keep pace with the others. My older brother Joe often stood at the center of that energy. He carried himself with natural confidence. People noticed him immediately when he entered a room. My father believed strongly in his future, and many of us believed it as well. I admired him deeply. He seemed fearless in situations that made others uncertain. When challenges appeared, he approached them directly rather than stepping back. Watching him taught me an important lesson about courage. Courage does not always mean feeling no fear. Sometimes it simply means moving forward despite the presence of it. The world beyond our home continued to shift during these years. Newspapers carried stories of political struggles and economic hardship. Nations argued and negotiated. Leaders made decisions that shaped the direction of millions of lives. Though I was still young, these events slowly entered my awareness. At dinner, my father sometimes spoke about them with strong opinions. He believed that the world was changing rapidly and that strong leadership would be required in the years ahead. At that time, such conversations felt distant, like discussions about storms far beyond the horizon. I listened but did not yet imagine that I would one day stand inside those storms myself. Childhood rarely announces the moment when it begins to fade. It slips away quietly as responsibilities grow and curiosity deepens. As I grew older, the questions in my mind became more serious. I began to wonder not only about my own future, but about the future of the country and the world around it. Why did nations disagree so strongly? Why did some leaders succeed while others failed? Why did moments of peace sometimes collapse into conflict? These were not easy questions, and I did not expect simple answers. But the desire to understand them grew steadily. Looking back now, I realize that the busy rooms of my childhood taught me more than I understood at the time. In those rooms, I saw ambition, determination, disagreement, humor, and resilience. I saw how people responded to success and how they reacted when plans did not unfold as expected. Those lessons stayed with me long after childhood ended. They shaped the way I listened to others, the way I spoke when it mattered, and the way I tried to understand the responsibilities that would eventually come. At that moment in life, however, the future still remained unclear. I was simply a young man growing within a family that believed strongly in possibility. The road ahead had not yet revealed its direction, but slowly, step by step, I was beginning to move toward it. As the years of childhood slowly moved forward, I began to understand that the world beyond our home was far larger and more complicated than I had once imagined. When you are very young, the world often feels small. It is defined by familiar rooms, familiar streets, and the steady presence of family. But as time passes, that small world begins to widen. New people appear. New ideas enter your mind. The horizon stretches further each year, and with it comes the quiet feeling that life will eventually ask something important of you. During those years, I spent much of my time learning, though not always in the way teachers expected. School was a place where rules and schedules shaped each day. Lessons followed one another in a steady order. We read, we wrote, we listened, and we tried to remember the things we were told were important. Sometimes I enjoyed those moments. Other times my thoughts wandered beyond the classroom walls. I often wondered about the stories behind the facts we were learning. History lessons in particular captured my attention. It was not the dates alone that interested me, but the lives that surrounded them. Each date represented decisions made by real people who faced uncertainty just as we did. They had fears, doubts, and hopes, yet they still moved forward and shaped the world. That idea stayed with me. It suggested that history was not written by distant figures who lived completely different lives. It was written by people who once stood at crossroads, unsure of what would happen next. My health continued to rise and fall during those years. Some seasons brought energy and strength. Others brought fatigue and quiet days when rest was necessary. Doctors offered many explanations, but as a young man, I rarely thought about the details of those discussions. What I felt most clearly was the desire to prove that weakness would not define me. Whenever I felt stronger, I pushed myself harder. I joined sports when I could. I challenged my brothers in small competitions. I tried to show both myself and others that determination could overcome the limits placed before me. Those efforts did not always succeed, yet they built something valuable inside me. They built persistence. Persistence is a quiet form of strength. It does not shout or demand attention. It simply continues forward, step after step, even when progress seems slow. I began to see that life was not a single moment of triumph, but a long series of efforts that slowly added up to something meaningful. My father continued to influence the way I viewed the world. His expectations remained high, but they were paired with a strong belief that our generation would face challenges different from those of the past. He often spoke about global events and the shifting balance of power between nations. To a young student, those ideas sometimes felt distant, yet they planted seeds of curiosity that continued to grow. I wanted to understand why nations competed, why alliances formed and collapsed, and why moments of peace sometimes gave way to conflict. These questions did not yet guide my life, but they stayed in the background of my thoughts, waiting for the day when they would demand greater attention. During this time, I also discovered the importance of travel. Leaving familiar surroundings changes the way a person sees the world. When you move beyond your own country or culture, you begin to realize that every place carries its own history and perspective. What seems obvious in one place may appear completely different somewhere else. These experiences quietly widened my understanding. They showed me that leadership requires more than confidence. It requires the ability to listen and learn from people whose experiences may be very different from your own. My older brother Joe remained a strong presence in my life. His confidence continued to grow as we both moved toward adulthood. Many people expected him to follow a path toward leadership, and he accepted that expectation with enthusiasm. Watching him strengthened my own determination. Though our personalities differed, our goals often moved in the same direction. We both believed that a life should stand for something larger than personal comfort. That belief became a guiding idea during my later years. It suggested that success alone was not enough. A meaningful life required purpose. The world outside our classrooms was also beginning to change rapidly. Newspapers carried stories of rising tensions across the globe. Nations were preparing for conflicts that would soon reshape the 20th century. Though we did not yet know exactly how events would unfold, the sense that history was accelerating became impossible to ignore. Conversations about responsibility and service became more common among young people of my generation. Many of us began to ask ourselves what role we might play if the world demanded it. For me, these thoughts arrived quietly at first. I did not wake one morning with a clear vision of the future. Instead, the idea of service slowly formed through small experiences and observations. I saw how leadership could influence the direction of events. I saw how courage sometimes appeared not in grand speeches, but in difficult decisions made under pressure. I saw how the character of individuals could shape the fate of entire communities. These realizations did not immediately lead me toward politics. At that stage, I was still a student exploring possibilities, but the foundation was slowly being built. The combination of family influence, personal challenge, education, and global change was guiding me toward a path that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Looking back now, I see those years as a period of quiet preparation. The world had not yet placed its greatest demands upon me, yet the lessons necessary to face those demands were already forming. Life rarely announces the importance of such moments while they are happening. They seem ordinary at the time. Only later do we recognize how they shaped the person we became. At that stage of my life, I was still searching, still learning, and still discovering the direction my future would take. But beyond the horizon, events were already moving, and before long, the calm years of study would give way to a time when action was no longer optional. As the years of study slowly moved toward their end, I began to feel a quiet pressure building somewhere deep inside me. It was not a loud feeling, not the kind that demands attention. It was softer than that, almost like a whisper that appears when life begins to shift from youth into responsibility. Childhood had been a time of curiosity, questions, and observation. But now something different was forming. The world was no longer something I simply watched from a distance. It was beginning to feel like a place that might one day expect something from me. During these years, I studied at Harvard, a place filled with restless minds and endless conversations about the future. Walking through the campus in the early mornings, I often felt the strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty that many young people experience when they stand between youth and adulthood. Harvard was more than classrooms and books. It was a gathering of ideas. Students came from many places, each bringing their own experiences and beliefs about how the world should work. In lecture halls and libraries, people debated history, politics, economics, and the direction of modern society. Sometimes those discussions were calm. Other times they were intense. But they always reminded me that the future of any country is shaped by the ideas that young people choose to carry forward. Growing up in a family where politics and global events were often discussed, these conversations felt familiar to me. Yet Harvard presented them in a new way. Here, no one cared about your last name, unless your ideas had strength behind them. If you spoke, you had to speak with clarity. If you made an argument, you had to defend it. That environment forced me to listen carefully and think before responding. Slowly, I learned that leadership is not built only on confidence. It grows through understanding, patience, and the ability to consider different perspectives before making a decision. My health continued to challenge me during these years. There were days when I felt strong enough to keep pace with anyone around me, and there were other days when fatigue returned without warning. Illness had followed me since childhood, and at times it reminded me that life does not always move according to our wishes. Yet those struggles also strengthened my determination. Each time weakness appeared, I pushed myself to continue forward. I wanted to prove that physical difficulty would not decide the direction of my life. In quiet moments, I sometimes wondered whether the path ahead would demand more strength than I possessed. But doubt can also sharpen a person's focus. Instead of allowing uncertainty to stop me, I used it as a reason to work harder. I studied longer hours. I read more widely. I tried to understand the forces shaping the world beyond the university walls. During this time, my interest in international affairs grew stronger. The world was entering a tense period. Nations watched one another carefully, unsure of what the future might bring. Newspapers carried stories of political tension, economic difficulty, and growing conflict across continents. Leaders spoke about security and alliances. Some spoke about peace, while others prepared quietly for the possibility of war. I followed these events closely. The idea that decisions made in distant capitals could affect the lives of millions fascinated me. It also raised an important question in my mind. What kind of leadership was required in a world filled with such uncertainty? One of my most important academic projects during this period focused on international politics and the events that had pushed nations toward conflict in the past. Studying those moments revealed something important to me. History is rarely simple. When we look back, we often imagine that the correct decisions were obvious. But for the people living through those moments, the choices were far more complicated. Leaders acted with limited information, facing pressure from many directions. Understanding that reality changed the way I thought about power. Power was not just authority or prestige, it was responsibility carried under conditions where every choice could shape the future in ways no one could fully predict. Outside the classroom, life continued with the energy that defines university years. Friendships formed through long evenings of conversation and shared curiosity about the future. We spoke about ideas, ambitions, and the uncertain world waiting beyond graduation. Each person carried a different story, and listening to those stories expanded my own perspective. It reminded me that no single viewpoint can fully explain the complexity of human experience. Travel also played an important role in shaping my thinking during these years. Seeing other countries changes the way a person understands the world. Cultures differ, histories differ. Yet everywhere people share many of the same hopes for stability, opportunity, and peace. Observing those similarities strengthened my belief that cooperation between nations was possible if leaders approached one another with patience and respect. As my time at Harvard slowly approached its end, I began to think more seriously about the direction my life might take. Several paths stood before me. Business offered stability and opportunity. Writing interested me because ideas have the power to influence people in quiet but lasting ways. Public service also remained in the back of my mind, though at that time it still felt like a distant possibility rather than a clear decision. During my final months at the university, I often walked alone across the campus in the evenings. Those walks gave me time to reflect on everything that had shaped me so far. The lessons of childhood, the expectations of family, the challenges of health, the ideas discovered through books, and the changing world beyond America's borders all seemed to connect in ways I was only beginning to understand. I could feel that the calm years of study were coming to an end. Something larger waited beyond the horizon. The world itself was moving toward a moment that would demand courage from an entire generation. I did not yet know exactly what role I would play in that story. But deep inside, I felt certain of one thing. When the time came, I did not intend to watch history from a distance. I intended to step forward and become part of it. When my years of study were ending, the calm rhythm of university life slowly began to fade. A young man can feel when one chapter of life is closing, even before the next one fully begins. It is not always dramatic. Often it feels like a quiet shift in the air. The same buildings stand, the same streets exist, the same conversations continue. But something beneath the surface has changed. The future no longer feels distant. It begins to move closer, almost like a tide rising toward the shore. At Harvard, I still walked through old halls filled with books and ideas. Students debated politics, philosophy, and history, as they always had. Professors spoke about past wars and past leaders, as if those moments were safely behind us. But beyond the campus, the world was beginning to feel less stable. Newspapers carried heavier headlines. Radio voices sounded more serious. The names of distant cities appeared again and again, not because of culture or trade, but because of conflict. At first, these events felt far away. Young people often believe that the great storms of the world belong to other generations. We assume that history has already had its dramatic moments, and that our own time will be quieter. But slowly, the distance between our lives and the events of the world began to shrink. Nations were preparing for confrontation. Alliances shifted. Fear spread quietly through governments and across borders. It is a strange feeling to realize that the world may soon demand something from you. When you are young, the future often appears as a wide field of possibilities. You imagine careers, travel, success, perhaps even recognition. But war changes the shape of that imagination. Suddenly, the question becomes simpler and heavier at the same time. Where will you stand when events begin to move? My father had always believed strongly in the idea of duty. In our home, success was never meant to be an end in itself. He believed that privilege carried responsibility. Those lessons had been repeated many times when I was growing up, and like many lessons from childhood, they remained quietly in the background for years. But as the world darkened, those old words began to feel more real. The decision to serve did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It formed slowly through thought and conversation. I had never been the strongest man physically. Illness had followed me through many years of my life. There were times when doctors believed my health might prevent me from doing certain things. I understood those concerns. My body had often reminded me of its limits. But there is something stubborn in a person who has lived with weakness for a long time. Instead of accepting those limits, you begin to push against them. Each time someone suggests that you should step back, a quiet voice inside you insists that perhaps you should step forward instead. When war began spreading across the world, I felt that same voice becoming stronger. Many young men were preparing to serve. They did not all come from the same background or the same circumstances. Some had known hardship their entire lives. Others had grown up with greater comfort. But the war did not care about those differences. It demanded people. Joining the Navy felt natural to me. The ocean had always represented something powerful in my imagination. It was wide, unpredictable, and filled with challenges that could not be avoided through clever words or careful planning. At sea, reality is direct. Weather changes quickly. Distance becomes uncertain. Decisions must be made without delay. Military training introduced a different rhythm to life. Days began early. Orders were clear. Physical endurance was tested constantly. The body was pushed to its limits and sometimes beyond them. For a man who had spent many years reading and thinking, the transition into such a structured world was dramatic. Yet there was something clarifying about it as well. Training strips away unnecessary details. You learn quickly that comfort does not matter very much. What matters is discipline, reliability, and the ability to act when a task must be done. In the military, you cannot wait for the perfect moment to feel confident. You act first, and confidence follows through repetition. My health still followed me during those months. There were days when pain reminded me that my body had its own history. But each challenge became something I refused to surrender to. I wanted to prove, not to others, but to myself, that the limitations of the past would not decide the future. Eventually, I was assigned to command a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific. These small vessels, known as PT boats, were fast and lightly built. They were designed to move quickly across the water, striking when opportunity appeared and disappearing before larger ships could respond. Life aboard a PT boat was far from comfortable. The space was tight. Equipment filled most of the deck. The smell of fuel and salt water stayed with you constantly. The sea itself became part of daily life in a way few people ever experience. But the most important part of that life was not the boat. It was the crew. A small crew at sea becomes something like a family, though not the gentle kind. It is a family built on shared work, shared danger, and shared fatigue. Each man depends on the others. When conditions become difficult, there is no room for hesitation or selfishness. As a captain, I understood quickly that leadership in such an environment is simple in theory, but demanding in practice. The men beside you must trust your judgment. They must believe that when danger appears, you will remain calm. They must know that your decisions will protect them as much as possible. Trust cannot be created through speeches. It grows slowly through daily behavior. If a captain loses control in small moments, the crew will not believe in him when the crisis arrives. Our missions in the Pacific were often carried out at night. Darkness covered the sea, while engines moved quietly through the water. The horizon sometimes looked empty, but we knew that enemy ships could appear at any moment. Night patrols carried a special tension. Sound traveled differently across water. Shapes appeared and disappeared without warning. Every man aboard remained alert, listening for signals, watching the horizon, waiting for instructions. War, when you're living inside it, is not always dramatic. Much of the time, it feels like waiting. Waiting mixed with tension. Waiting mixed with fatigue. But within that waiting exists the constant knowledge that everything could change in a single instant. That instant came one night when our boat, PT-109, was struck by a Japanese destroyer. The collision happened suddenly. There was almost no time to react. One moment we were moving through the darkness, and the next the boat was torn apart by the force of the impact. Fire and wreckage spread across the water. Men were thrown into the sea. In such moments, there is no time for reflection. The mind narrows to a single task: survival. I looked for the crew. Some were injured, others were struggling in the water. The boat itself was no longer truly a boat. It had been broken by the collision. Leadership in that moment meant focusing on the immediate problem. Who was alive? Who could swim? Who needed help? One of the crewmen, Patrick McMahon, had been badly burned. His injuries made it nearly impossible for him to swim on his own. Leaving him behind was not an option. Using the strap of his life jacket, I pulled him through the water while the others followed. The swim toward a small nearby island was long and exhausting. Every stroke demanded energy that the body barely had left. Eventually, we reached land, but reaching land did not mean safety. The island was small, supplies were limited, the men were injured and exhausted. We were deep in enemy territory, uncertain whether rescue would come. Those days tested everyone. Hunger and thirst became constant companions. The sun burned during the day and darkness returned each night. But something remarkable also appeared among the crew. No one surrendered to despair. Men helped each other despite exhaustion. Injured sailors encouraged those who were stronger. Small acts of cooperation became the difference between survival and collapse. Eventually, we encountered local islanders who helped deliver word of our situation to Allied forces. Rescue came not through dramatic heroism, but through communication, patience, and persistence. When we were finally brought to safety, the experience had changed me. Before the war, I had admired courage in stories. After PT-109, I understood it more clearly. Courage is not always loud. Often it is simply the decision to keep moving, when stopping would be easier. Those lessons stayed with me long after the war ended. They shaped the way I thought about leadership, responsibility, and the fragile nature of peace. Because once you have seen how quickly life can change on a dark ocean night, you never again believe that history is distant. You understand that decisions made by leaders far away can send ordinary men into extraordinary danger. And you begin to believe that those decisions must always be made with the deepest possible care. When the long struggle of the war slowly began to move toward its end, the world I returned to was not the same world I had left behind. But the greater truth was this: I was not the same man either. War has a way of changing a person quietly and permanently. It does not always happen in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it arrives through 1,000 smaller experiences. Through fatigue, through fear, through responsibility. Through the steady understanding that life is more fragile than it once seemed. When I first came home, people often asked about the war. They wanted stories about bravery, about danger, about survival. Some of those stories were easy to tell. Others were harder. Not because they were secret, but because words rarely capture what those moments truly felt like while living through them. War is often described with heroic language after it ends. But during the war itself, life is much simpler and much harder at the same time. Men wake up tired. They perform their duties. They rely on one another. They hope that the day will end safely. And when danger appears, they do what must be done without waiting for courage to feel comfortable. After the experience of PT 109, I carried a deeper understanding of responsibility. The survival of my crew had depended on many things: determination, cooperation, endurance, and perhaps also a certain amount of luck. No leader controls every outcome, but a leader does control how he acts when events become uncertain. These lessons stayed with me when the war ended. Returning home did not mean that life suddenly became simple again. In many ways, it felt more complicated than before. The world was celebrating peace, yet everyone knew that the peace was fragile. The war had revealed how dangerous international conflict could become when leadership failed. Many young men returning from service were asking similar questions. What kind of world should exist after such destruction? What responsibilities did our generation carry now that we had seen the consequences of global conflict? For me, these questions gradually led toward public life. Politics had always been present in my family. My father had been deeply involved in business and government. Conversations about national affairs were common in our home. But before the war, politics had seemed more distant to me. It was something important, certainly, but not something I imagined as the center of my own life. War changed that perspective. When you have seen how quickly events can turn dangerous, politics stops feeling abstract. Decisions made in Washington or in other capitals are no longer distant discussions. They are choices that shape the lives of real people, including young men who may one day be asked to risk everything. This realization slowly pushed me toward the idea of public service. At first, I considered several different paths. Writing interested me. I enjoyed studying history and political events. I believed that ideas could influence the way people understood the world. In fact, during this period, I wrote a book examining the decisions that had shaped the years before the war. Studying those earlier political choices reinforced something I had already begun to understand. History does not move by accident alone. It is shaped by the courage or weakness of individuals placed in positions of authority. Good leadership can guide a nation away from disaster. Poor leadership can move it directly toward danger. These thoughts remained with me as I considered what to do next. My health, however, continued to challenge me. The injuries and strain from the war had made certain problems worse, particularly the pain in my back. There were days when simple movements required more effort than they should have. Doctors sometimes advised caution. They suggested that a quieter life might be wiser. But by that time, I had already spent many years resisting the idea that physical weakness should define my future. The war had strengthened that determination rather than weakening it. Pain may slow a person, but it does not necessarily stop him. Eventually, the opportunity arrived to run for a seat in the United States House of Representatives. The idea of entering politics was not simple. Public life demands constant energy. It requires patience with criticism and resilience against disappointment. Yet the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the right path. I believed that the experiences of my generation needed to be represented in government. Those who had lived through the war understood its cost. We understood how easily nations could drift toward conflict if leaders failed to act wisely. Campaigning for office introduced me to a completely different kind of challenge. Instead of commanding a boat in the Pacific, I was now traveling through neighborhoods and cities, speaking with citizens about their concerns and hopes. Politics at the local level is not about grand speeches. It is about listening. People spoke about jobs, education, housing, and the future of their families. Many of them had also experienced the war in different ways. Some had served overseas. Others had waited anxiously at home for news of loved ones. These conversations reminded me that leadership must always remain connected to the everyday lives of ordinary people. It is easy for governments to become distant. Offices, titles, and power can create barriers between leaders and citizens, but those barriers weaken democracy. A leader must remember that the purpose of power is service. The campaign required long days and constant travel. My health sometimes protested against the pace, but determination carried me forward. When the election finally arrived and I was chosen to serve in Congress, I felt both pride and responsibility. Entering public office is not simply a personal achievement, it is a trust placed in you by thousands of people who expect you to represent their interests honestly. Serving in Congress introduced me to the complex machinery of government. Debates filled the chambers, committees examined legislation, members argued passionately about the direction of national policy. At times, the system seemed slow and frustrating. Progress rarely moved as quickly as anyone hoped. Yet I also saw the strength of democratic institutions. Different voices could speak. Disagreements could occur without violence. Decisions could be examined from many perspectives before becoming law. These principles are easy to overlook when politics becomes loud and emotional, but they are essential to the survival of a free society. During my early years in Congress, I continued thinking often about the lessons of the war. The world was entering a new period of tension known as the Cold War. Though the great global conflict had ended, the struggle between powerful nations was far from finished. The threat of nuclear weapons introduced an entirely new danger to international relations. For the first time in history, a future war between major powers could destroy entire cities within minutes. This reality demanded careful leadership. Strong nations must defend themselves, but they must also seek ways to prevent conflicts from escalating beyond control. As I worked in Congress, I tried to remember the young men I had served with in the Pacific. Their faces remained with me. Policies discussed in government chambers might someday affect people just like them. That knowledge created a constant reminder of why responsible leadership matters. Public life is never perfect. There are moments of disagreement, criticism, and disappointment. But there are also moments when progress becomes possible. Slowly, step by step, I began to understand that leadership in government required many of the same qualities I had seen during the war. Patience, calm under pressure, a willingness to listen, and the courage to act when action becomes necessary. These lessons would guide me through the years that followed, because the path ahead would lead far beyond Congress, toward challenges that none of us could yet fully imagine. When my first years in Congress began, I quickly discovered that public life moves at a very different pace than most people imagine. From a distance, politics can appear dramatic. Speeches fill the newspapers, debates appear on radio and television. Decisions seem to rise suddenly from a single vote or a single moment. But the truth is slower and more complicated. Most of the work of government happens quietly. It happens in committee rooms, where lawmakers read long reports and discuss details that the public rarely sees. It happens in long conversations between colleagues who do not always agree, but must still find ways to move forward. It happens through patience, negotiation, and the careful balancing of many different interests. During my early time in Congress, I spent many hours simply listening. I listened to older members who had served through earlier political battles. I listened to experts who studied economic policy and international affairs. I listened to citizens who visited Washington, hoping their voices would reach someone in government. Each conversation revealed something important. Leadership in a democracy does not come from speaking the loudest. It comes from understanding the many concerns that exist within a country and finding ways to guide those concerns toward common ground. At times, this process can feel frustrating. Progress rarely moves quickly. Compromise becomes necessary even when it feels uncomfortable. But democracy has always required patience. The alternative to compromise is often conflict, and history had already shown us how dangerous conflict could become when nations allowed disagreements to grow without restraint. While learning the daily rhythm of Congress, I also continued studying international affairs. The end of the Second World War had not brought permanent peace. Instead, it had created a new kind of tension between powerful nations. The United States and the Soviet Union had emerged from the war as two global powers, with very different political systems and very different visions of the future. This rivalry soon became known as the Cold War. Unlike previous conflicts, the Cold War did not always involve open battles between armies. Instead, it was fought through influence, alliances, intelligence operations, and political pressure across many regions of the world. The presence of nuclear weapons made the situation even more serious. For the first time in human history, a full war between major powers could destroy entire civilizations within hours. This reality forced leaders in Washington and other capitals to think carefully about every decision they made. Strength remained necessary, but restraint became equally important. During this period, I traveled whenever possible to observe other parts of the world firsthand. Travel has always been one of the best teachers in politics. Reading reports about foreign countries can provide information, but standing in those countries, speaking with their people, and seeing their circumstances with your own eyes creates a deeper understanding. In Europe, I saw nations still recovering from the devastation of war. Cities carried visible scars. Buildings destroyed during bombing raids still stood as reminders of the recent past. Families were rebuilding their lives slowly, one year at a time. These scenes reinforced the lesson I had learned during my naval service. War may sometimes be necessary, but it is always costly. The responsibility of leadership is not only to win wars when they occur, it is also to prevent wars whenever possible. Back in Washington, I continued building relationships with other members of Congress. Some of them shared my views about international responsibility. Others believed the country should focus more on domestic issues. Healthy disagreement is part of democratic government. The important question is not whether disagreements exist, but whether leaders can handle those disagreements with respect and reason. Over time, I also began thinking about the next stage of my political career. Serving in the House of Representatives had been an important beginning, but many of the most significant debates about national policy took place in the United States Senate. The Senate handles treaties, major international questions, and long-term legislative decisions that shape the direction of the country. Running for the Senate would not be easy. The campaign would require enormous effort, travel, and financial support. It would also expose me to greater public attention and greater criticism. But by that time, I had already learned that meaningful goals rarely appear through easy paths. The campaign for the Senate required months of preparation. I traveled across Massachusetts, speaking with voters in towns both large and small. These conversations reminded me again that politics is ultimately about people rather than ideology. Citizens spoke about their daily lives. They spoke about education for their children, about employment opportunities, about healthcare, and about the security of their communities. At the same time, many people also worried about the direction of the world. The Cold War had created a constant sense of tension between the superpowers. News about nuclear weapons and international crises appeared regularly in newspapers. Voters wanted leaders who could guide the nation through these uncertain years with intelligence and caution. Campaigning is physically exhausting work. Long days of travel are followed by long evenings of speeches and meetings. For someone with ongoing health problems, the strain can be significant. But determination can carry a person further than comfort ever could. With the support of many friends, volunteers, and family members, the campaign continued steadily. Eventually, Election Day arrived, and the voters of Massachusetts chose to send me to the United States Senate. Winning the Senate seat represented both an honor and a new responsibility. The Senate is often called the world's greatest deliberative body, and its traditions reach back many generations. Serving there meant participating directly in the debates that would shape American policy during one of the most complex periods in modern history. The years ahead would bring difficult questions about international strategy, economic development, and civil rights within the United States. Each of these issues required thoughtful leadership. But at that moment, I could not yet see how far the road of public service would eventually lead. I simply knew that the lessons of my earlier life remained with me. The discipline of the Navy, the responsibility of leadership, the understanding that decisions made in government chambers eventually touch the lives of ordinary citizens. These lessons formed the foundation of everything that would follow, because the path ahead was moving slowly toward a challenge greater than any I had yet faced. A challenge that would place me before the entire nation, the presidency itself. Serving in the United States Senate introduced me to a broader view of national leadership. In the House of Representatives, debates are often quick and energetic. The Senate moves at a different rhythm. Discussions are longer, and the weight of decisions sometimes feels heavier because the issues often reach beyond domestic policy and into the global stage. During my years in the Senate, I continued to focus strongly on international affairs. The Cold War was shaping nearly every major decision made in Washington. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union influenced conflicts across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Every new crisis had the potential to grow into something larger. For many Americans, the Cold War existed mostly in newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts. But inside government, those tensions were discussed every day. Reports arrived constantly from diplomats and intelligence officials. Each report described a world that was balancing carefully between peace and confrontation. The presence of nuclear weapons made these tensions far more serious than any earlier rivalry between nations. For the first time in human history, leaders possessed weapons powerful enough to destroy entire cities within moments. The responsibility that came with such power could not be taken lightly. While working in the Senate, I often thought about the young sailors I had served with in the Pacific. Many of them had been ordinary men who had never expected to be placed in extraordinary danger. Their lives had been shaped by decisions made by leaders far away. That memory remained with me whenever I considered questions of war and peace. Leadership must never forget the human cost hidden behind strategic language. At the same time, the United States itself was changing rapidly during the 1950s. The country was growing economically. New industries were expanding. Technology was advancing quickly. Families were moving into new suburban communities, and millions of young Americans were entering universities for the first time. Yet, alongside this progress, there were also serious challenges. The struggle for civil rights was becoming more visible. African American citizens across the country were demanding equal treatment under the law. Demonstrations, court cases, and political debates were bringing these issues into the center of national attention. For many Americans, the question of civil rights was no longer something that could be postponed. The country had fought a war in the name of freedom. Now, many citizens were asking whether that promise of freedom truly applied to everyone. In the Senate, I listened carefully to these debates. Change rarely comes easily to any society, but justice has a way of pushing its way forward over time. During these same years, my own political future slowly became a subject of conversation among supporters and advisors. Some believed that I might one day seek the presidency. At first, I approached these suggestions with caution. The presidency is the most demanding office in American government. It requires not only political skill, but also physical endurance, emotional balance, and the ability to make decisions under extraordinary pressure. I understood the seriousness of such a responsibility. But as the years passed, the possibility of a presidential campaign began to feel more realistic. The United States was entering a new era. Younger voters were becoming more engaged in politics. Many people believed the country needed leadership that could speak confidently about the future, rather than simply defending the past. Eventually, I decided to seek the Democratic nomination for president in the election of 1960. The campaign that followed would become one of the most intense political contests in modern American history. Travel filled nearly every day. Speeches were delivered in large cities and small towns. Reporters followed every movement, every statement, every decision. Campaigning for the presidency requires enormous energy. It demands long hours, constant focus, and the ability to remain calm, even when criticism becomes sharp. One of the most unusual moments of that campaign came during the televised debates between myself and my opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon. Television was becoming an increasingly powerful influence in American life. For the first time, millions of citizens could watch presidential candidates speak directly in their homes. The debates allowed voters to observe not only the policies of each candidate, but also their manner, confidence, and leadership style. Many historians would later say that these televised debates played a major role in shaping the outcome of the election. But during the campaign itself, everything felt uncertain. Election campaigns are unpredictable by nature. Poll numbers rise and fall. Public opinion shifts quickly. Every speech carries the possibility of success or disappointment. Through all of this, I tried to remain focused on the larger purpose of the campaign. The United States was entering a new decade filled with opportunity and risk. Scientific progress was opening doors to space exploration. Economic growth was transforming industries. At the same time, international tensions remained high. I believe the country needed leadership prepared to meet these challenges with confidence and imagination. Eventually, Election Day arrived in November 1960. The results were extremely close. Millions of Americans cast their votes, and the final outcome was decided by a narrow margin. When the results were announced, I had been elected President of the United States. At 43 years old, I would become one of the youngest presidents in American history. Standing before the nation after that victory, I felt both gratitude and deep responsibility. The presidency is not simply a personal achievement. It represents the trust of an entire nation. The challenges ahead would test that trust in ways none of us could fully predict, because the years that followed would include moments of hope, moments of crisis, and decisions that would shape the course of history. The quiet boy who had once watched the world from a window was now preparing to guide a nation through one of the most dangerous periods of the 20th century. When I stood before the nation to take the oath of office in January of 1961, the cold air of Washington carried a feeling that was difficult to describe. The ceremony itself followed traditions that had existed for generations. The words of the oath were simple and familiar. Yet behind those words stood the enormous weight of responsibility that comes with the presidency. For many people, the inauguration appears as a celebration. Crowds gather, flags wave, music plays. The moment symbolizes the peaceful transfer of power, one of the most important traditions in American democracy. But for the person taking that oath, the experience carries a deeper meaning. At that moment, you realize that the decisions you will make may influence the lives of millions of people. Every conversation, every meeting, every document placed before you may carry consequences that stretch far into the future. That realization does not arrive slowly. It arrives immediately. The first months of a presidency are often filled with preparation. A new administration must assemble its advisors, organize departments, and review the many issues already facing the government. Yet in my case, the challenges of the world did not wait long. The Cold War continued to shape nearly every international decision. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union remained tense. Both countries possessed nuclear weapons capable of causing unimaginable destruction. The responsibility of leadership during such a time required careful balance. A president must protect the security of his nation, but he must also recognize that every action carries the possibility of escalation. The first major crisis of my presidency came only a few months after the inauguration. It involved Cuba, an island nation located only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. At that time, Cuba had recently experienced a revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power. His government soon developed close ties with the Soviet Union, raising serious concerns within the United States. American officials feared that a communist government so close to our shores could become a strategic threat. Plans had already been developed during the previous administration to support Cuban exiles who hoped to remove Castro from power. This operation would later become known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. When the plan reached my desk as president, I faced a difficult decision. The idea behind the operation was that Cuban exiles, supported quietly by the United States, would land on the island and inspire a larger uprising against Castro's government. Some advisors believed the plan had a strong chance of success. Others warned that it could fail and create serious consequences for American credibility. Leadership often requires making decisions in situations where certainty does not exist. After reviewing the information available at the time, I approved the operation. The invasion began in April of 1961. Unfortunately, the plan did not unfold as expected. The Cuban uprising that planners had hoped for did not occur. The invading forces quickly encountered strong resistance from Castro's military. Within a short time, the operation collapsed. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion became one of the most difficult moments of my early presidency. Criticism arrived quickly from many directions. Political opponents argued that the decision had been poorly judged. Supporters of stronger action against Cuba believed the operation had not gone far enough. In moments like these, a president must accept responsibility. I publicly acknowledged that the failure belonged to my administration. Leadership does not mean avoiding blame when things go wrong. It means facing the consequences honestly. The experience also provided an important lesson. Good leadership requires careful questioning of advice, even when that advice comes from experienced officials. After the Bay of Pigs, I made certain that future decisions would involve broader discussion and deeper examination of possible outcomes. The Cold War soon presented another challenge. In August of 1961, tensions between East and West Germany reached a new level when the Soviet-backed government in East Germany began constructing a barrier through the city of Berlin. This barrier would become known as the Berlin Wall. Families were suddenly divided. Streets that had once connected neighborhoods were closed overnight. Armed guards stood along the barrier to prevent people from crossing. The construction of the Berlin Wall became a powerful symbol of the division between the democratic West and the communist East. For the United States, the situation required careful management. Direct military confrontation in Berlin could easily escalate into a larger conflict between nuclear powers. At the same time, abandoning the people of West Berlin was not an acceptable option. My administration reaffirmed the American commitment to defend the freedom of West Berlin. Additional troops were sent to Europe as a demonstration of that commitment. The crisis did not lead to open war, but it reminded the world how fragile the balance of the Cold War truly was. Through these early challenges, I learned something that every president eventually understands. The office does not offer simple days. Even during moments when the public sees calm, complex decisions are unfolding behind closed doors. Every morning begins with intelligence reports describing developments around the world. Every afternoon brings meetings with advisors discussing economic policy, defense strategy, and diplomatic negotiations. The presidency requires constant attention. Yet even amid these responsibilities, I believed it was important to speak to the nation about hope and possibility. In 1961, I addressed Congress with a proposal that would capture the imagination of millions of Americans. I announced the goal of sending a man to the moon before the end of the decade. At the time, this objective seemed almost impossible. Human beings had only recently begun launching satellites into orbit. Space travel was still in its earliest stages. But the space program represented more than scientific exploration. It symbolized the spirit of innovation and ambition that had always defined the United States. The race to the moon would demonstrate the power of human curiosity and determination. It would also show that peaceful achievements could inspire the world even during a time of geopolitical tension. The years of my presidency would continue to bring both crises and opportunities. Each day required decisions that balanced caution with courage. And the greatest challenge of all was still waiting just ahead. A confrontation that would bring the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before. The Cuban Missile Crisis. When people later looked back at my presidency, Many of them focused on a single moment when the world seemed to stand on the edge of catastrophe. That moment arrived in October of 1962, during what would become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Until then, the Cold War had been a long and dangerous rivalry, but it had remained mostly indirect. Nations competed through influence, alliances, and proxy conflicts around the world. Yet, in October of that year, the tension suddenly became immediate and frighteningly real. The crisis began when American intelligence discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missile sites in Cuba. These missiles had the potential to reach major cities across the United States within minutes. For the first time, the threat of nuclear attack was not something distant across oceans or continents. It was only 90 miles away from our shores. When the photographs from reconnaissance flights were brought into the White House and placed before me, the meaning of those images became clear immediately. This was not simply another political problem. It was a direct challenge to the security of the United States and to the balance of power in the world. If those missiles became operational, the strategic situation would change dramatically. Millions of American lives could be placed in danger with almost no warning. The first reaction in such moments is often anger. Some military advisors believe the correct response would be immediate airstrikes against the missile sites. Others argued that a full invasion of Cuba might be necessary to remove the threat completely. Yet the situation demanded careful thought rather than rapid action. A military attack might destroy the missiles, but it could also provoke a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. And if that confrontation escalated, the result could be nuclear war. Nuclear war was not an abstract concept. Both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed weapons powerful enough to destroy entire cities. The use of even a fraction of those weapons could bring unimaginable devastation to the world. Because of this reality, the decision facing the presidency was not simply about Cuba. It was about the survival of civilization itself. During the days that followed, we held constant meetings with advisors, military leaders, and diplomats. Every possible response was examined carefully. Each option carried its own risks. Airstrikes might succeed quickly, but they could also trigger retaliation in Europe or elsewhere. Doing nothing would allow the missiles to remain in place. An invasion would almost certainly lead to open war. In the end, I chose a different path. Instead of immediate attack, the United States would establish a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent additional Soviet weapons from reaching the island. In diplomatic language, this action was called a quarantine. The blockade would signal our determination to stop the missile installations while still leaving room for negotiation. It was a risky decision. Soviet ships were already moving toward Cuba. If those ships attempted to break through the blockade, American naval forces might be forced to stop them. A single miscalculation could lead to gunfire, and gunfire could lead to something far worse. During those days, the atmosphere inside the White House was tense but disciplined. Reports arrived constantly from intelligence agencies and military commanders. Diplomats communicated with allies around the world. Every movement of Soviet ships was tracked carefully across the Atlantic Ocean. Meanwhile, the American public waited anxiously as news of the crisis spread. Families listened to radio broadcasts and watched television reports, wondering what the next hours might bring. Many people feared that nuclear war might arrive suddenly. I spoke directly to the nation, explaining the situation and the steps our government was taking. Honesty was essential. Citizens needed to understand the seriousness of the moment without falling into panic. Leadership during crisis requires calm communication as much as decisive action. The days that followed were among the most intense of my presidency. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line in the ocean. For a time, it appeared possible that they would attempt to break through. American naval forces prepared for the possibility of confrontation. Yet slowly the situation began to shift. Some Soviet ships stopped or turned back before reaching the blockade. At the same time, diplomatic messages began moving between Washington and Moscow. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent communications suggesting possible ways to resolve the crisis peacefully. These messages were complex and sometimes contradictory, but they offered a path away from confrontation. After careful negotiation, an agreement was reached. The Soviet Union would remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States would pledge not to invade the island and would also remove certain American missiles stationed in Turkey. The arrangement allowed both sides to step back from the brink without humiliating the other. When the crisis finally ended, the sense of relief across the world was enormous. For 13 days, humanity had come closer to nuclear war than ever before. The outcome demonstrated something important about leadership during dangerous times. Strength is necessary, but restraint can be even more powerful. The goal of leadership is not simply to win confrontations, it is to protect the future of the people who depend on those decisions. The Cuban Missile Crisis left a lasting impression on me. It showed how fragile peace can be when powerful nations face one another with suspicion and fear. It also showed that communication and patience can sometimes prevent disaster even when tensions appear impossible to resolve. After the crisis, both the United States and the Soviet Union began searching for ways to reduce the risk of future nuclear confrontation. Direct communication lines were established between Washington and Moscow so that leaders could speak quickly during emergencies. Discussions about arms control slowly began to take shape. The world had looked into the possibility of its own destruction and understood how close it had come. For me personally, the crisis reinforced the belief that leadership requires constant attention to the consequences of every action. Decisions made in a single room can influence the fate of millions beyond those walls. The responsibility of carrying that knowledge never becomes lighter. Yet, it is precisely that weight which reminds a leader why careful judgment matters. Because the purpose of leadership is not power for its own sake. The purpose is the preservation of peace, the protection of human life, and the hope that future generations will never again come so close to the edge of catastrophe. After the Cuban Missile Crisis ended and the immediate danger of nuclear war began to fade, the world entered a brief moment of reflection. The confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union had revealed how close humanity had come to disaster. It had also shown that even in moments of intense rivalry, reason and communication could still prevent catastrophe. For me, the experience reinforced an idea that had been forming for many years. Leadership must not only respond to crises, it must also create a vision for the future. Nations cannot live forever in fear and reaction. They must move forward with purpose. In the months following the crisis, I focused strongly on the idea that the United States should pursue achievements that inspired hope rather than conflict. One of the most powerful examples of this vision was the American space program. When I first proposed the goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade, many people believed the idea was unrealistic. The technology required to accomplish such a mission did not yet fully exist. Rockets were still in their early stages of development. Astronauts had only begun traveling into orbit around the Earth. But the challenge itself carried meaning beyond science. Space exploration represented the human desire to push beyond limits. It represented curiosity, courage, and cooperation among thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians working together toward a single goal. The race to the moon also carried symbolic importance during the Cold War. The Soviet Union had achieved early successes in space, with the launch of the first satellite and the first human spaceflight. Many Americans believed the United States needed to demonstrate its own commitment to technological leadership. Yet for me, the deeper purpose of the space program was not simply competition, it was inspiration. I believe that great achievements can unite a nation. They remind citizens that progress is possible when people work together with determination and imagination. In speeches across the country, I spoke about the challenge of reaching the moon. I often said that we choose to pursue such goals not because they are easy, but because they are difficult. Difficult goals force a nation to develop its best abilities. They encourage innovation, cooperation, and a spirit of exploration that benefits society in many ways. At the same time, my administration continued working on issues closer to home. One of the most important of these was the question of civil rights. The United States had long declared itself a nation founded on equality and freedom. Yet many American citizens still face discrimination and injustice because of their race. Across the country, civil rights leaders organized peaceful demonstrations demanding equal treatment under the law. These demonstrations sometimes faced strong resistance from local authorities who opposed change. The images broadcast on television showed Americans confronting one another in ways that troubled the conscience of the nation. I believed that the federal government had a responsibility to support the principle of equal rights. Justice cannot remain an abstract promise. It must become a reality in everyday life. In 1963, my administration proposed major civil rights legislation designed to end segregation in public facilities and protect the voting rights of all citizens. The debate surrounding civil rights was intense. Some leaders believed change should move slowly. Others believed it was already long overdue. I understood that passing such legislation would require courage from members of Congress as well as patience from citizens across the country. But the principle itself was clear. A nation dedicated to liberty must ensure that liberty applies to everyone. While domestic issues demanded attention, the global stage continued to present new challenges. The Cold War did not disappear after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tensions remained between the United States and the Soviet Union, though both sides now recognize the danger of direct confrontation. During this period, I delivered a speech at American University that expressed my hopes for a different kind of relationship between the two nations. In that address, I spoke about the importance of pursuing peace, even while acknowledging the differences between political systems. I argued that peace does not require ignoring disagreements. Instead, it requires the willingness to manage those disagreements without resorting to violence. The speech represented a call for what I described as a strategy of peace. Not peace through surrender or weakness, but peace through understanding and careful diplomacy. Shortly after this speech, negotiations began that would lead to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This agreement prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Although it did not eliminate nuclear weapons entirely, it represented an important first step toward reducing the dangers associated with the arms race. The treaty demonstrated that even during a period of global rivalry, cooperation on issues affecting all humanity was still possible. Looking back at that time, I often felt that the presidency involved balancing two different responsibilities. One responsibility was managing immediate crises when they appeared. The other was guiding the nation toward long-term progress. Crisis management demands calm thinking and rapid decisions. Building a future requires vision and patience. Both forms of leadership are necessary. As the year 1963 continued, I remained focused on these goals. The United States was moving forward with its space program. Civil rights legislation was being debated in Congress. Diplomatic efforts were seeking ways to reduce tensions between nuclear powers. There was a sense that despite the challenges of the Cold War, the world might slowly move toward a safer future. History, however, rarely moves in straight lines. The hopes of one moment can be interrupted by events no one expects. And before the year ended, the journey of my life in presidency would reach a sudden and tragic conclusion that would forever become part of the story of America. As the year 1963 moved forward, my days were filled with the constant rhythm that defines the presidency. Meetings began early in the morning. Reports arrived from across the world. Advisors discussed economic plans, diplomatic negotiations, and military strategies. Each decision required careful thought, because every action taken by the United States influenced not only our own country, but also the global balance during the Cold War. Despite the pressures of leadership, I remained hopeful about the direction the nation was taking. The space program continued to advance. Scientists and engineers worked tirelessly toward the goal of reaching the moon. Universities across the country expanded research programs. Young Americans were entering scientific and technical fields with excitement about the possibilities of the future. At the same time, the debate about civil rights was becoming one of the most important moral questions facing the country. The legislation proposed earlier in the year was still being discussed in Congress. Supporters argued passionately that equality under the law must finally become reality. Opponents feared that rapid change would disrupt existing social structures. Leadership during such moments requires both determination and patience. Social progress rarely happens overnight. But history often shows that when a nation confronts its deepest questions honestly, it becomes stronger rather than weaker. During the autumn of 1963, I began planning several trips across the United States. Presidential travel serves many purposes. It allows a president to meet citizens directly, to observe local issues, and to strengthen political relationships that help move national policies forward. One of these trips was scheduled for Texas. Texas was an important state politically, and there had been tensions within the Democratic Party there. Some leaders believed that a presidential visit could help unify the party and strengthen support before the upcoming election year. The visit was arranged for November. When we arrived in Dallas on the morning of November 22nd, the atmosphere appeared welcoming. Crowds gathered along the streets. Many people waved flags and held signs. Presidential motorcades often create a sense of excitement wherever they travel. For citizens, seeing the president in person can feel like witnessing a piece of history. The motorcade moved slowly through the city so that people could see and greet us. Standing in the open car allowed me to wave to the crowds lining the streets. These moments often remind a president of the connection between government and the people it serves. But history sometimes turns in ways that no one can predict. As the motorcade moved through Dealey Plaza, gunshots suddenly broke the calm of the afternoon. In an instant, the celebration turned into confusion and tragedy. I was struck by the gunfire while seated in the presidential limousine. The vehicle accelerated quickly toward Parkland Memorial Hospital as the Secret Service attempted to respond to the attack. Doctors worked urgently in an effort to save my life. Despite their efforts, the injuries were too severe. Shortly after arriving at the hospital, my life came to an end. News of the assassination spread rapidly across the United States and around the world. Millions of people learned the news through radio and television broadcasts. Many experienced shock and disbelief. The death of a president is always a national tragedy, but the sudden and violent nature of the event created a deep emotional impact for the country. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president later that same day aboard Air Force One, ensuring the continuity of government. In the days that followed, Americans gathered to mourn. The funeral ceremonies in Washington brought leaders from many nations together to pay their respects. Citizens lined the streets as the procession moved through the Capitol. For many people, the events of that November day became a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. Yet a life is never defined only by the moment it ends. The true measure of a life comes from the ideas, actions, and hopes that continue afterward. During my presidency, I often spoke about the responsibilities of citizenship. I believed that the strength of a nation depends not only on its leaders, but on the participation of its people. One of the most famous lines from my inaugural address expressed this belief clearly. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Those words were meant to remind Americans that democracy requires involvement. Progress happens when citizens contribute their energy, creativity, and dedication to the common good. Although my time in office was brief, the ideas we pursued continued to shape the future. The civil rights legislation introduced during my presidency would later become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, advancing equality across the nation. The space program continued moving toward the goal of landing astronauts on the moon, which would be achieved later in the decade. Efforts to reduce nuclear tensions between superpowers continued through diplomatic agreements and communication. History often remembers leaders for specific events, but leadership is also about inspiration. It is about encouraging people to believe that progress is possible, even during times of uncertainty. The journey of my life began with a quiet boy watching the world from the window of a busy family home. It continued through war, public service, and the responsibilities of the presidency. Each stage carried its own lessons about courage, responsibility, and the fragile nature of peace. If there is one truth I hope people remember, it is that the future is never created by a single individual. It is shaped by millions of people who choose to participate in the life of their nation. And when citizens choose hope over fear, cooperation over division, and service over selfishness, the possibilities for the future become limitless. When a life ends suddenly, people often search for meaning in the moments that came before it. They look back through speeches, decisions, and events, trying to understand what kind of path that life truly followed. In the case of a president, that reflection becomes even stronger because the actions of a leader reach far beyond the private world of family and friends. They touch the lives of millions of citizens, and sometimes influence the direction of the entire world. Looking back at my own journey, I often think not about the titles that were held or the offices that were occupied, but about the lessons learned along the way. Leadership is not something that appears suddenly when a person enters public office. It grows slowly through experience. It grows through hardship, through responsibility, and through the quiet realization that decisions carry consequences for many others. My earliest lessons about leadership did not come from politics at all. They came from childhood, from living in a large and energetic family where ambition and competition were part of everyday life. My father believed that success required effort and courage. My mother believed that character required discipline and reflection. Those influences shaped the way I looked at the world long before I imagined myself entering public service. The next great teacher was the war. Service in the Navy revealed the difference between authority and responsibility. Authority can be given through rank or title. Responsibility must be earned through action. The men who served beside me on PT 109 trusted my leadership not because of my background, but because our survival depended on clear decisions and mutual loyalty. In moments of danger, there is no room for pretense. People quickly recognize whether a leader is steady or uncertain. That lesson remained with me throughout my political career. Later, when I entered Congress and eventually the Senate, I began to understand another dimension of leadership. In democratic government, the role of a leader is not to command, but to persuade. Policies must be debated. Compromises must be reached. Different voices must be heard. This process can be slow and sometimes frustrating, yet it is also one of the greatest strengths of a free society. Democracy does not move quickly, because it allows many perspectives to be considered before decisions are made. When I eventually became president, these earlier lessons combined in ways that shaped my approach to leadership. The presidency is often seen as a position of enormous power. In reality, it is also a position of enormous limitation. A president does not act alone. Every decision is influenced by advisors, by Congress, by public opinion, and by events unfolding around the world. Understanding those limits is part of responsible leadership. The most important decisions of my presidency were often those involving the balance between strength and restraint. During the Cold War, the United States faced a powerful rival in the Soviet Union. Both nations possessed nuclear weapons capable of destroying civilization. In such an environment, a leader must show determination without allowing pride or anger to push events toward catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated this challenge clearly. The pressure to act quickly and aggressively was intense, yet the path chosen ultimately required patience and negotiation as well as strength. The peaceful resolution of that crisis showed that even in moments of extreme tension, careful diplomacy can prevent disaster. Another part of leadership involves inspiring people to imagine possibilities beyond the difficulties of the present. The goal of landing a man on the moon was not simply a technological challenge. It was a symbol of human curiosity and determination. It reminded people that great achievements often begin as bold ideas that seem impossible at first. The space program encouraged thousands of young Americans to pursue careers in science, engineering, and exploration. In that way, the vision of reaching the moon became part of a larger story about human progress. At home, the struggle for civil rights revealed the moral dimension of leadership. A nation that declares liberty as its founding principle cannot ignore injustice within its own borders. The civil rights movement challenged the country to live up to its highest ideals. Supporting that movement required political courage because change often brings resistance. But history shows that societies grow stronger when they confront injustice rather than avoid it. Leadership, therefore, involves more than managing crises or achieving victories. It involves guiding a nation toward its better values. It requires the willingness to speak about fairness, opportunity, and dignity, even when such conversations are uncomfortable. As people reflect on my presidency, some may focus on the dramatic events that occurred during those years. Others may remember particular speeches or policies. But for me, the deeper meaning of public service lies in something simpler. It lies in the belief that government can be a force for progress when it is guided by thoughtful and responsible leaders. No president accomplishes these goals alone. Every achievement in government depends on the cooperation of countless individuals. Advisors, legislators, scientists, soldiers, teachers, and citizens all contribute to the direction of a nation. The idea that democracy belongs to the people is not simply a phrase. It is a reality that becomes visible whenever citizens participate actively in shaping their society. My hope has always been that Americans would continue believing in their capacity to build a better future. The challenges faced during the 20th century were enormous. World wars, economic crises, ideological conflicts, and technological change tested the strength of many nations. Yet throughout those struggles, the United States continued moving forward because its citizens believed in the possibility of improvement. That belief remains one of the most powerful forces in any democracy. It encourages innovation, cooperation, and resilience, even when circumstances appear difficult. If the story of my life carries any lesson, perhaps it is this. Leadership is not about personal greatness. It is about service. It is about recognizing that the opportunities we receive in life carry with them the responsibility to contribute something in return. Every generation faces its own challenges. Some challenges involve war or international tension. Others involve social change or economic transformation. But in every era, the future depends on individuals who are willing to step forward and take responsibility for the common good. The measure of a nation is not found only in its wealth or military strength. It is found in the character of its citizens and the ideals they choose to pursue together. If those ideals include freedom, justice, curiosity, and compassion, then the future will continue moving toward progress even after individual leaders have passed from the stage of history. In that sense, the legacy of any presidency does not belong entirely to the president. It belongs to the people who carry forward the work that began during those years. And as long as citizens remain willing to ask what they can do for their country, rather than only what their country can do for them, the promise of democracy will continue to grow. When people speak about the life of a public figure, they often focus on the loudest moments. They remember elections, speeches, victories, crises, and tragedies. These events become the markers that history books use to describe an era. Yet a life, even the life of a president, is not built only from those dramatic moments. It is also formed from quieter experiences that rarely appear in headlines. It is shaped by conversations with friends, by lessons learned during youth, by doubts faced during difficult times, and by the steady effort to move forward even when the future is uncertain. As I reflect on the journey of my life, I often return to the idea that history is not something distant or abstract. It is something lived by ordinary people in ordinary moments. The events that later appear significant often begin quietly, without any sign that they will become important. When I was a child growing up in Massachusetts, I could not have imagined that my life would one day lead to the presidency. My days were filled with school, family life, and the normal concerns of youth. At times, illness slowed me down and forced me to spend long hours reading while others played outside. At the time, those moments felt frustrating. Yet those quiet hours also allowed me to observe the world and think about it carefully. Life has a way of preparing us for the future through experiences that do not seem important at first. The same is true for the years I spent in military service. When the war began, I did not enter the Navy expecting that a single event would later define that period of my life. I simply believed that serving my country during a difficult time was the right thing to do. Yet, the experience of PT 109 and the survival of my crew became a powerful lesson about courage and responsibility. It taught me that leadership is not about seeking recognition. It is about standing beside others during moments when fear and uncertainty are strongest. Those lessons remained with me long after the war ended. When I later entered politics, I often remembered the faces of the men who had served beside me. They represented the countless citizens whose lives are shaped by the decisions made in government. In many ways, the purpose of public service is to honor that responsibility. The presidency itself often appears larger than life. The White House, the ceremonies, the attention of the world press can create an image of enormous authority. Yet behind those images, the daily work of a president is deeply human. It involves reading reports late at night, meeting with advisors who hold different opinions, and weighing decisions whose consequences may not become clear for many years. Some decisions bring immediate praise. Others bring criticism. Many bring uncertainty. In those moments, a leader must rely not only on information, but also on judgment and character. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated how fragile the balance of the world could be during the Cold War. The decisions made during those days required patience, discipline, and the willingness to search for peaceful solutions even while military options remained possible. Avoiding nuclear war was not simply a diplomatic victory. It was a reminder that the ultimate goal of leadership must always be the preservation of human life. The pursuit of peace does not mean weakness. On the contrary, it requires strength of character and the courage to resist the easy path of confrontation. Another part of leadership involves encouraging people to believe in the future. The American space program represented one expression of that belief. The challenge of reaching the moon inspired scientists, engineers, and young students across the country. It reminded us that progress often begins with imagination. When a nation chooses to pursue great goals, it invites its citizens to participate in something larger than themselves. The energy created by that shared purpose can transform society in ways that extend far beyond the original project. The same principle applies to the pursuit of justice. The struggle for civil rights during the early 1960s forced the United States to confront a painful truth. For many citizens, the promise of equality had not yet become reality. Addressing that injustice required courage from activists who marched peacefully for their rights, from citizens who supported change, and from political leaders willing to move the country toward fairness. Progress in human rights is rarely comfortable. It often challenges long-established traditions and attitudes. Yet history consistently shows that societies become stronger when they expand the circle of freedom. These reflections lead to a larger question about legacy. What remains after a life has ended? For a president, part of that legacy is found in policies, laws, and international agreements. These tangible outcomes shape the direction of a nation for years or even decades. But another part of legacy is less visible. It exists in the ideas that continue to inspire people. During my presidency, I often spoke about the importance of civic responsibility. The phrase asking citizens to consider what they can do for their country was not intended as a slogan. It was a reminder that democracy depends on active participation. A government cannot function well if citizens remain distant from public life. Democracy requires people who are willing to vote, to debate, to volunteer, and to contribute their talents to the common good. When individuals take responsibility for the well-being of their communities, the entire nation becomes stronger. In that sense, the future of any country is not determined solely by its leaders. It is determined by the character and engagement of its citizens. Each generation inherits the work begun by those who came before it. The challenges may change, but the need for courage, compassion, and imagination remains constant. The meaning of a life, therefore, is not measured only by the positions one holds or the honors one receives. It is measured by the contribution one makes to the lives of others. If a life encourages people to believe in the possibility of progress, if it inspires them to serve their communities and protect the principles of freedom, then that life continues to have meaning long after it has ended. History remembers individuals, but the true story of human progress is written collectively. Every teacher who educates a child, every scientist who pursues discovery, every citizen who works to improve society becomes part of that larger story. And when people choose cooperation over division, curiosity over fear, and service over indifference, the future becomes brighter than the past. In the end, that may be the quiet meaning behind the life of any leader. Not the power that was held for a short time, but the ideas that continue moving forward through the lives of others. When the story of a life reaches its final chapter, people often ask a simple question: what remains after everything else has passed? Titles fade with time, offices change hands, new leaders arrive, and new generations begin shaping the future in their own way. Yet certain ideas continue traveling forward long after the individuals who first spoke them are gone. In the case of public service, the true legacy of a life is not measured only by the years spent in office. It is measured by whether those years helped move a nation closer to its highest ideals. Throughout my life, I believed that the United States represented more than a geographic place or a political system. It represented an idea. The idea that free people, working together through democratic institutions, could build a society where opportunity and liberty were available to all. That idea has never been perfect. No nation lives fully up to its ideals at every moment in history. But the strength of a democracy lies in its willingness to continue striving toward those principles, even when progress is difficult. The years of my presidency occurred during a time when the world was filled with tension and uncertainty. The Cold War divided nations and placed humanity under the shadow of nuclear weapons. Many people feared that the future might bring conflict on a scale never before imagined. Yet even during those dangerous years, there were signs of hope. Diplomatic efforts began reducing the risk of nuclear confrontation. Scientific progress expanded human knowledge. Citizens across the United States demanded greater equality and justice within their own society. These movements showed that history does not move only through crises. It also moves through the determination of ordinary people who believe that improvement is possible. The American space program eventually succeeded in sending astronauts to the moon in 1969, several years after my presidency had ended. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and spoke those famous words about a giant leap for mankind, the achievement belonged not to a single administration, but to thousands of individuals who had dedicated their work to exploration. The moon landing demonstrated what can happen when a nation commits itself to a bold goal and supports the creativity of its scientists and engineers. The struggle for civil rights also continued after my presidency. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helped transform American law by protecting equality under the Constitution. These changes did not erase every injustice, but they represented major steps toward fulfilling the promise of freedom for all citizens. Progress often unfolds slowly, but each generation carries the responsibility of pushing that progress further. Another important legacy of the early 1960s involved the effort to manage the dangers of nuclear weapons. Agreements such as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty created the first steps toward arms control between rival powers. These efforts were not perfect solutions. The Cold War continued for many years afterward, but they demonstrated that even adversaries could recognize the shared interest of preventing global destruction. The survival of civilization requires cooperation in certain fundamental areas. The world that followed my presidency continued facing challenges both familiar and new. Wars occurred in distant regions. Political movements rose and fell. Technological advances changed the nature of communication, transportation, and daily life. Each generation encountered its own tests. But the central questions of leadership remained remarkably consistent. How can nations protect their security without sacrificing their values? How can societies encourage innovation while preserving fairness? How can political systems respond to the needs of citizens while avoiding division and conflict? There are no permanent answers to these questions. Each era must examine them again and again. That is why democratic participation remains so important. A free society depends not only on leaders, but on citizens who remain engaged with the future of their country. Voting, public discussion, community service, and education all contribute to the strength of democracy. When citizens withdraw from these responsibilities, the institutions of freedom become weaker. But when people remain involved and informed, democracy continues renewing itself. Throughout my life, I often spoke about the responsibilities that accompany freedom. Freedom provides opportunity, but it also requires commitment. It asks individuals to consider not only their personal ambitions, but also the well-being of their communities. The phrase asking citizens to think about what they can do for their country captured that idea in simple language. It was never meant as a demand for sacrifice without reward. Instead, it was an invitation for people to see themselves as participants in the shared project of building a better society. History shows that great progress often begins with small acts of responsibility carried out by ordinary individuals. A teacher who inspires curiosity in a classroom. A scientist who continues researching a difficult problem. A public servant who chooses integrity over convenience. A citizen who works to improve the life of a neighborhood. Each of these actions contributes quietly to the larger story of a nation. When people look back at the early 1960s, they may remember dramatic moments such as the Cuban Missile Crisis or the beginning of the space race. But they may also remember the spirit of optimism that existed during that time. There was a belief that the future could be shaped through intelligence, cooperation, and courage. That belief remains valuable today. The challenges facing humanity will always change. Technology evolves. Political systems develop. International relationships shift. But the fundamental qualities required for progress remain constant. Curiosity about the unknown, respect for human dignity, commitment to peaceful cooperation, and the courage to pursue difficult goals. If those qualities continue guiding the actions of citizens and leaders alike, then the story of progress will continue long after any individual life has ended. And in that sense, the legacy of a life dedicated to public service does not belong only to the past. It lives within the choices made by future generations. Because the work of building a more peaceful and just world is never truly finished. It is simply passed forward.